101, there are a couple disclaimers that I want to point out. I am specifically going to be talking about like more of the affordable pen range, and I'm also specifically going to be talking about more beginner knowledge, I think. I guess if there are no questions, I am going to get started on the next section, which is talking about the fountain pen inks. I mentioned at the very beginning, fountain pens cannot use just any regular ink. Fountain pen inks will just be labeled as fountain pen inks, and I absolutely recommend just sticking to that. And the reason is because if you have like a regular ink, for example, if you take like Liquitex ink, after letting the bottle of ink sit there, you can see like this powder settle down on the bottom. Those particulates will clog up the feed and the collectors in your fountain pen. Your pen will not write if it clogs. Just don't do anything except for actual fountain pen inks. They're just a kind of a special subset of inks. Usually they are either dye-based, which means there's no particulates whatsoever, or if they do have particulates, that they are really tiny so that they don't as easily clog in your fountain pen. So there's three main categories of fountain pen inks. You got dyes, pigments, and shimmer. So let's talk about dye first. This I think is what most are. This is, for example, a dye ink made for fountain pens right here. It says for fountain pens, dye ink. What this means, I think the best way to describe this is you basically have colored liquid. Like the liquid itself has color. From a completely scientific perspective, this is actually not entirely true, but I think this is the easiest way to describe it. One of the biggest things to keep in mind if you have a dye ink is that because they're chemicals with a specific color, you don't want to mix a dye ink with another dye ink unless it says it's okay, because they might actually have a chemical reaction. Especially don't mix inks from different companies, because different companies will use completely different like solvents and chemicals inside of their inks, and they could, react, and it's just not a good idea. Usually, because it's just liquid color, you can mix this with water. Usually, not always, so I would definitely double check, but usually they're all miscible in water. So if you want, like, if you say like, oh, well, this is a really nice color, but I want it to be just a little bit lighter, you can just put a little bit of water in it. But if you do that, just make sure that you are using distilled water and not just tap water. The reason for that is because if you use tap water, they usually have like little minerals in it and little particulates, and those things can clog up your pen. So distilled water doesn't have any. You can just buy them at your grocery store. Okay, now let's talk about pigment inks. Pigment inks are a little bit more rare. If you have a pigment ink, they are a little bit different from a regular dye-based ink in that the liquid in the fountain pen ink is usually clear. What gives it the color are these little tiny little dust specks. So you basically can imagine like tiny little spherical things of color floating around in your ink. One really easy way to tell, this is not always true, but it's usually true. One really easy way to tell if your pen is pigment or dye or ink is if you look at a dye-based ink, can you guys tell how that's kind of like the ink is kind of see-through-y? Like it's very clear, it's very see-through. Whereas if you have a pigment ink, do you guys see how you can't see through that at all? It's kind of cloudy. So usually if it's a cloudy ink, it is almost 100% a pigment ink. Whereas if it's clear, it's more likely, not always, but more likely that it's a dye ink. Usually these will all be like labeled on your bottle as well. One of the nicest things about pigment ink is that it's usually waterproof. These little colored dust speckles that is like kind of mixed into some kind of solvent. So when that solvent dries off, that dust is left behind, and that dust is usually not miscible in water. If you're looking for a waterproof ink, try to go for a pigment. Usually they take a little bit more maintenance. They're not supposed to clog up your fountain pen, but even if you have really tiny things, if you get a lot of them, it starts to pile up and can start to clog. So you do want to just keep your eye out for that. Don't let your pen dry out you want to be really careful about mixing water with your pigment inks. Usually, the liquid that's in a pigment based ink is not 100% water. It usually has some kind of chemical in it. And the reasoning for that is if you have little spheres of colored like stuff, right? That particle is usually non-polar, and water happens to be a polar solvent. If you have a non-polar particle, you can only use a non-polar solvent. Otherwise, it's just all going to settle at the bottom. So if you add a little bit of water, it might be fine. It might still be under the miscibility limit, but if you start to add more and more, at one point it's going to hit a limit and all of your particulates are going to like come out. So just be really careful about that. One last thing, these are usually best with hooded pens. I actually don't have a hooded pen to show you. The closest one I have is my platinum carbon pen. That outer casing goes pretty far up the nib and it almost completely encloses the back side of the nib. So what that does is that it helps minimize the amount of air that the ink will see. This kind of a pen will dry out a little bit less fast. And that's nice because if you have a pigment ink, you don't want it to dry out. The last set of inks that I have is Shimmer Inks. So Shimmer Inks is a combination of a dye and a pigment. So you have some kind of dye-based ink, but you also have really teeny tiny metallic sparkles. Do you guys see that like metallic stuff on the bottom? So this is the sparkles. If I swish it around a little bit, it should start to mix back into the ink. You can kind of think about the little metallic pigments as particulates. So these are going to require the most maintenance out of these three types of inks. The sparkles will settle over time. So if you're just filling up your pen, make sure you kind of don't shake it because that's going to introduce air, but just kind of swish it to make sure these sparkles mix in. Also, if your pen has metallic ink in it, don't store it nib side down. Like don't store it like this. And the reason is because you saw like how those little sparkles settle to the bottom. If you like store your pen like this, all of the sparkles are going to settle inside of the feed area, so it's going to actually clog it. I would recommend storing it sideways. For the other inks, there's a little bit of debate about whether storing in certain directions actually help or not. It doesn't seem like it makes a huge difference. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about three different, I guess, parameters of an ink. Shading, sheen, and wetness. So shading describes the range of color saturation and intensity that an ink will have depending on how much is on the paper. So this ink here is probably one of the most famous shading inks. This is Noodler's Apache Sunset. You can kind of tell that it goes from this bright yellow to almost a red. So this ink has really good shading. That is one thing to keep in mind if you want something that shades or if you just want like a specific color. Definitely check that out. The second thing is sheen. Sheen is also a change in color, but it's a little bit different than shading. It almost looks like a shimmery coating on top of your ink. And it occurs because you have thick layers of color. The thickness of that color will make it so that the ink on the paper will interact slightly differently with the light than areas that only has a little bit of ink. So sometimes it comes off with very different colors. So this one is Organic Studios Nitrogen. It's actually this bluish purplish ink, but it sheens like this really bright red. Sheen, I will say, also kind of depends on the type of paper that you write with. You want non-absorbing paper to get a really good sheen. The final thing I want to talk about is wetness. So wetness describes the heaviness of a flow, and it's actually a sum parameter of your ink and your nib and your feed. So if you have, for example, a really wide nib, it's going to be wetter than a really skinny nib just because it has more ink coming out of it. And because inks have different chemicals, it's got different properties, the way it flows out of a nib is going to be slightly different. And so if you have a dry ink, it might not flow quite as much. It's not like one is better than the other, it's just kind of what you're looking for. For example, really just want a tiny cute little writing, then you probably want to go for a little bit drier ink. If you want like really big, bold, lots of color, lots of shading and sheen, then you probably want to go with a wetter ink. So now let's talk about buying the inks. There's 4 separate volumes that you can buy inks. And that is cartridges, sample vials, small bottles, or big bottles. Cartridges I already kind of mentioned before, but they come like this. Usually you buy them in like packs of 5 or 6 or something like that. These only hold about 1 milliliter. They are limited to colors. Not all cartridges are universal to all pens, so just watch out for that. Sample vials is actually my favorite way to buy an ink. This is not sold by the actual manufacturer of the ink. If you buy from a company that like is a department basically of a lot of fountain pen stuff, they can sell these tiny little test vials of different inks. This is a really good way to test out an ink before you decide to buy it. There's a really big difference between seeing an ink in person on paper than seeing it on a computer screen. It can be very different. If it's a photo, the colors are going to be a little bit off. You're not going to get any of the sheen. If it's a shimmer ink, you're not going to get a lot of that shimmer impact. So it's always a good idea to kind of get these teeny little sample vials. They're usually like $1 to $3, so they're also really affordable. Now let's talk about the small bottles. So these are all small bottles. Usually range from about 10 to 30. So this one is 15 milliliters. This is Pilot's Iroshizuku. And this one is Sailor's Ink Studio 123. I think this is 20 milliliters, something like that. So these are cute little affordable inks. These are really good if you find an ink that you like, you know, you want to use it over and over again. For example, this one's probably going to last about 10 to 15 refills of a regular cartridge. You know, this one's going to last up to like 20. Now, if you find an ink that you want to be with forever, you can get bigger bottles. They range from about 40 to 80 milliliters. This is the same company, so I'm going to compare these two. This is the small bottle. Again, this is 15 milliliters, and this is the full-on 50 milliliter bottle for this ink. This is really great if, again, you just have like one color you really like, or if you want to share, since this is a lot cheaper. So this little bottle here, in Japan, I got these in Japan. So in Japan, it's $7. This is 15. This is 7. Look at this difference. So if you can use it, go for a big bottle. I will a lot of times buy like inks, and then I'll buy these little like test tubes, and then I'll split it into a bunch of little test tubes and like send it to friends so they can use it. Let me give you some ink recommendations. I like fountain pens, but ink is really where my love is at. In the USA, Noodler's ink, they make so much ink and so much variations of it, and on top of it, they're all super duper cheap. So definitely go check it out. Nemesine and Organic Studio are newer ink companies. They're like little ink boutiques. But they have a couple inks that I was super interested in. They look really gorgeous. So that cool red sheening ink that I showed earlier is from Organic Studio as well. Europe has a ton of companies that just sell inks instead of like making both inks and pens. So J Urban, Diamine, Dea Trementis, those are some really big ones. There's definitely a lot of other names. There's like tons and tons of ink companies. I have Korea on here. China doesn't make a lot of inks, at least not that I know of, but Korea has a new company called Colorverse, and then we're back in Japan. Sailor, I think, really dominates the ink scene, and then Pilot, they have their own standard ink, but really their Iroshizuku set is probably the most famous. Platinum has some inks, not a whole lot, but I'm a really big fan of this ink here, Carbon ink. This is a pigment. If you guys are looking to, like, I don't know, draw manga, for example, with a fountain pen, and you want something really dark, I would recommend the Carbon ink. Okay, now I'm not going to separate them by price because the price is generally around the same. Like I said, this was $7. This I think is at 10, and then this is like 15. They're all pretty cheap, I think. So I'm just going to talk about them in different brands. Noodler has a ton of inks. They have their standard inks, which is a lot, but they also have bulletproof, which is waterproof inks. They also have partial bulletproof, which means only some of the ink is waterproof. So I drew a little bit with my Pilot Cavalier a little bit earlier, but that was Black Swan with Australian Roses. It's hands down my favorite Noodler's ink. Very gorgeous, but it is partially bulletproof. Bernanke is a really fast drying ink, so if you guys are left-handed, Bernanke is one to check out. Bay State is very famous. This bright, like blindingly bright blue is the famous Noodler's Bay State blue, and it is archival, it is waterproof, it is like, it's so bright, it's like I didn't realize it was chemically possible to create a blue so bright. I will say, if you guys get it, that it will stain everything you love. I actually don't get it because I change colors pretty frequently, so I can't afford to stain a fountain pen. Some people absolutely love it. It's not really for me, but it's legendary, so I did want to point it out. Okay, so I got Nemesine at the bottom there. I think they don't really have lines, but Organic Studio has like 4 different lines with 4 different types. All really cool. I just kind of want to show the range of inks that we're talking about. This is not all of the inks. This is just some of the inks. So now let's talk about European brands. Europe has a ton of different companies, but I'm just going to focus on these 3 just because I think these 3 have some of the widest ranges and colors. So J. Urban is in general pretty dry. So if you guys want your ink to dry a little bit faster, for example, maybe J. Urban is where you want to go. They also have 2 collections, 1670 and 1798, that are shimmer inks. Absolutely gorgeous. This is their all famous Emerald of Chivor. It's a turquoise ink that sheens red and has gold sparkles. Diamine is one of the older companies. They have a ton of inks. I only have 1 bottle on me right now. This is a little bottle of Diamine Yellow. It's super bright, but they have a lot of inks. Diatramentis is also famous for having a lot of colors. One of the big things about Diatramentis is that they have a line of inks that are made to be mixed. So you can buy that set and mix whatever color you want. It is specifically made for mixing, so you don't have to worry about like chemical reactions and stuff inside your pen. These are some of the colors that we're talking about. Not all of them, but you know, some of the colors. For my personal recommendations, J. Urban, my favorite color is Diabolomenth, or Diabolomenth. I'm not really sure. It's this really bright, really refreshing turquoise color. For Diamine, Oxblood, I think, is one of the most famous. It's kind of this deep red, ox bloody kind of color, but looks really great in writing. Now let's move on to Japanese and Korean inks. Sailor, I think, really leads the scene in the amount of inks and colors that they have. They have the Nano series, which is Pigment, Shikiori, which is, they kind of revamped this series. I think this is probably one of their more famous ones, the Yamadori. It's again, it's like a turquoise ink. It sheens red. Storia is also a Pigment Ink. Ink Studio is actually a new series. It is 100 different sets of inks. It's actually not available in the United States yet. This is like their entire collection just in Ink Studio. It's so much color. It's so pretty. Okay, so for Pilot, again, I did mention they have their standard inks, but their Iroshizuku line is really the most famous. Look at that gorgeous, I can't get over how gorgeous these bottles are. But really cool stuff. And then Colorverse has, I don't have any yet. This is the next one on my list to get, but Colorverse has these really cute, really round bottles. I will say that one of the things I notice, especially about the Japanese inks, is that the colors tend to be a little bit more muted in comparison to European inks. So it's like a little bit more, I guess, subtle, maybe is the right word. So actually, if you look at these colors, so
stuff like this, you can kind of tell it's got like a little bit of a muted tone to it. So that is kind of like a Japanese style of ink, I guess. So I personally really like these muted colors, but of course it's all up to you and your preference. Okay, so we've talked about inks, and